I am sure, but we're glad that the rest of you are here. Most of you, I think, are muted. If you are not muted, please go ahead and mute yourselves. You are welcome to unmute to ask a question as needed, but muting will help us not hear all the background noise, so that will be good. Thank you to Farragut for hosting our in-person portion today. We are glad to be here with you all. And it's raining again today. So 3 of our 4 Sundays have been rainy Sundays. Not sure what that says, but there we are. So before we pray and begin our conversation today on Jacob and Joseph, are there any thoughts or questions that linger from last week when we were talking about Abraham and Isaac? I think I heard something. Someone have a question or a thought? No? All right. Oh. Debbie, did you have something you wanted to share about last week? Your box was just highlighted.
No. Was it?
No. No? Okay. All right, just double checking since you were highlighted. All right, well, then we will begin our final study together. And I'm going to begin with a prayer. This is a Lenten devotion by Walter Brueggemann, but it is based on Genesis 17. So I'm going to read that to remind you 4 through 6, and then offer the prayer that is in for this particular devotion. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. Let us pray. God, you are the one who gives us a future, who shatters our categories with extravagant generosity. Make us ready to receive this day and always. Amen. So, just to kind of bring us up to where we are right now, the first time we were together, we looked at Genesis 1, which is the creation story, and how God invites creation into being, the goodness of creation, that it was pleasing, it was beautiful, and the intentions that God set for all of life for us. The second time we were together, we looked at the story of the flood and the covenant that comes at the back end of that flood, kind of an uncreation story. So it was the backwards telling of creation. We saw the ways that human beings had overreached God's intentions and the well-being that God had set up. Things were no longer good. They were no longer pleasing and beautiful. And so God set out to destroy. But then God decided to remind God's self not to do that again. And so we have not only the covenant that God makes with Noah and all creation to not do that again, but then we have the rainbow, which is God's reminder to God's self. And in that, we see that God realizes that humans may continue to be wicked and evil at times, but God will continue to be with them and continue to work towards God's purposes and promises, even if they are going to be recalcitrant, that God's promises don't depend on the humans at that point. And so then we get to Abraham. God calls Abraham and Sarah and tells them to go, doesn't tell them where. We begin with this promise and this covenant to this people. All of Abraham's story is about the promise, about the ways that Abraham trusts the promise, the ways Abraham doesn't trust the promise, the ways Abraham and Sarah try to fulfill the promise for themselves, and the ways that those get thwarted. And ultimately, Isaac is born. Isaac is the promise bearer. In the meantime, Ishmael is born. Ishmael cannot be the promise bearer, but through Ishmael, there will also be great nations. So God blesses Ishmael as well, even though he's not the promise bearer. The covenant to be their God, they will be God's people. and God's going to be with them. There will be multiple generations as well as land. There's the promise of land that comes in that. So we ended last time, Isaac has been born. There was the testing of Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Isaac was not sacrificed. Isaac ends up getting a wife, Rebecca, and then Sarah dies. And that's how we ended last time. So today we're going to talk about Jacob and Joseph, who continue to be the promise bearers in this larger family of Abraham. And whereas the story of Abraham, and it's interesting really, as the tradition remembers, Isaac doesn't have a whole lot of place in the tradition. It's really Abraham and Jacob. We think about Isaac obviously has some place because he was the promise bearer, but the story really is bookended with Abraham and with Jacob, and then Joseph there at the end, who serves as the bridge to getting to Egypt. But so we were, the narrative talks about Abraham, and with Abraham, it is about the promise, getting to the promise, trusting the promise, believing the promise. For Jacob, it's going to be all about blessing. So God told Abraham that God would bless Abraham so Abraham could be a blessing to the nations. Jacob is going to be about living out that blessing piece. What does it mean to be a blessing, to be blessed so that you are a blessing? And so I think that's important as we start out. The promise is still there, obviously, but the focus shifts a little bit from what it means to anticipate and believe in this promise to what does it mean to live into it in terms of being a blessing. So that's kind of where we're going to go with Jacob. Any thoughts or questions before we go further? It's kind of our introduction. Seeing no one. And you are welcome to just unmute yourself and shout out your question when you have one or comment. So just as the story with Abraham, this promise kind of hit the roadblock of barrenness, we do again here, but it's not drawn out like it was with the birth of Isaac. But Rebecca too is barren. Isaac's wife, Rebecca, is barren. And so we're back to this delayed promise kind of thing. How do we trust? But Isaac prays to God, and quickly this is resolved in this piece of the story. And Rebecca becomes pregnant, her womb is opened, and this is in 25, chapter 25, the last part of 25, this is 32. Not going to read a lot today because we have an incredible amount of text to cover today. So I'm not going to read a lot. I hope you've read it, or if not, you will go back and read it. But this is in 25:32, Rebecca conceives. She has twins, and it says from the very beginning that these two are at odds with one another. They are struggling within her own womb. She talks to God about it. God says they're going to be divided against one another, and that is exactly what's going on. God tells her while she is pregnant that one will be stronger than the other, and that the younger will rule the elder, which brings up another issue here in this narrative, because in the ancient world, and still to some extent today, but particularly in the ancient world, there were the firstborn always got the stuff, the property, the whatever belonged, whatever the material wealth was. The oldest child got all of it, if not the bulk of it. And it was called the practice of primogeniture. And it looms large in the ancient world, and particularly here in scripture, because that's the way the world is ordered. That's the way things happen. Do we know about God? God doesn't really care about the way the world is ordered, right? God's going to do things the way God chooses to do things. And often it's inverting those sort of expectations and the way that the world does things. And so indeed, Esau is born first. His name comes from his appearance. He was red and hairy. He is born first. Jacob is born second, but Jacob is holding on to Esau's heel, the text tells us. And that's what his name means, heel grabber. And he is the one who's grabbing for what isn't actually his at the time. And so we see Jacob's nature gets displayed very early on. Jacob is, in the beginning of this story, all about himself. And yet we know already God has chosen Jacob to be the promise bearer because he says the younger will rule the older. And that's exactly what ends up happening. And so for these people of God and for us today, we are not fated to the way that the world is organized, right? We have God who is calling us into this promise, inverting norms and expectations, and calling us into this promise through the ones that we would least likely expect quite often. And so there's always this challenge to us. I think particularly God's people who get settled, there's a challenge to us. How much have we accommodated with those societal norms and the ways of the world? And how much is God calling us in a different way? And so Jacob here, right at the beginning, sort of puts that in front of us. He's counter to those expectations of the way things are supposed to be in the world, those expectations. We also see right here at the beginning, be faithful to a God who would have the second child. And of course, Isaac's the second child, right? But to have the second child be the promise bearer, to be faithful to this God is to be faithful to one who intentionally enters conflict. God knows God's doing something outside of the norm here in this, which means that we are likely to encounter some conflict ourselves as we follow this one who is inverting the norms of the ways of the world. So Jacob, we learn, is the one destined for the promise. He is going to be the promise bearer. He is going to be the one who bears the blessings into the world. But he's a bit of a rascal, heel grabber, self-interested at all the time. And so we enter into this narrative knowing that the whole narrative itself and our story as God's people is shaped by the capacity of our God to transform the power relationships around us, and through that transformation to bring well-being to everyone, but to particularly to those who are low, despised, and without claims of priority, which would be second children, the outcast, the marginalized, all of those kinds of things. So we see that Isaac is a second child, Jacob is a second child, and as we get to Joseph, Joseph's not only a second child, Joseph's an 11th child, and yet he is the promise bearer. So we see throughout our history as God's people that this is kind of God's way, not to do things the way that the world expects that they should be, the way should be done. One more thing to say about Jacob's story is, for those of us who have been in the church for any amount of time, this is a familiar story to us. And so I think we miss the scandal of it. It's pretty scandalous that God does these things, that God attached God's self to this one. I mean, we saw the ways that Abraham was kind of scandalous as well, but Jacob will be even more so. And so we see through that, that it is indeed God's very grace to us that is scandalous. We see that on the cross. We see that in the ways that what God calls us to upsets organized life. Even in the desert, when God says, you're going to take care of the strangers that come into your midst. You're going to leave the edges of your field so others can glean from those. All of that really just upsets everything and is rather scandalous. Okay, thoughts or questions? No. No? Okay. So then we're moving to chapter 27. Well, not yet. I want to say one more thing about 26. The end of 26. So there's not much about Jacob and Esau's childhood. We learned that Isaac has a preference for Esau because Esau's a man of the fields and he's a hunter and all those things. And Rebecca has a preference for Jacob, who tends to be sort of her favorite. There is one day where Esau's been out in the fields. He has been working all day. He comes back. Jacob has made lentil stew, which also scripture tells us was red. So it was red lentils, which re-emphasizes Esau's name, actually. But Esau's starving. He wants that. Jacob is cunning. Jacob wants something too. Jacob wants the birthright. And so he says, I'll give it to you, but you have to give me your birthright. Esau doesn't think through what he's doing. He wants what's right in front of him. And so he's willing to give it up. So we see here also that Jacob is willing to wait things out, right? To get what he wants. Esau is impulsive, but doesn't think through what he's doing. And so Jacob gets the birthright. In 27 is when Rebecca helps Jacob trick Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing. So there was the birthright, and then there was a blessing. And I think it's important to kind of take just a moment here to talk about blessing in the ancient world, because we use that word, have a blessed day. Blessed is kind of ubiquitous and meaningless today. But for the ancient people, and particularly for ancient Israel, this was very, very important, concretely important for them. And so blessing was understood as a world transforming act. Kind of hard to get our minds around it, but a blessing meant something. I mean, it was very symbolic, and the symbolic acts had genuine power. So for Isaac to put his hands on his child's head meant something. It wasn't just a touch. I mean, there was power that went from one to the other in that. Spoken words, the words that were spoken shaped human life. So what was said in a blessing was intentional and life-changing. Again, how many of you think on a Sunday morning when you stand for the benediction, which is a blessing, that something life-changing is about to be spoken? I mean, how many of us pastors think about that when we are speaking that benediction? But for the ancient people, they really did. They really did think that. And blessings had incredible power, the capacity to shape the future through language, gesture, and symbol. So this blessing, we may have thought, oh, well, he got the whole thing when he got the birthright, right? You know, like the will said, the oldest gets. But that was, you needed the blessing too. And in some ways, the blessing was even more important. And we see that how Esau responds and says, is there nothing left for me, when he finds out that Jacob has gotten it. So Isaac blesses Jacob, who he thinks is Esau, right? So there's deception going on, which kind of raises a question. Does God work through that anyway? Or was there something of like that was the way it was going to work? I think that's a question for us to struggle with. We're not going to try to answer it today, but it's an interesting question to ponder. Where was God in that? Was it the same thing like with Abraham, who was trying to save his own hide and ends up kind of getting in trouble and God saves him from that? Or was this the way that God intended it from the beginning? I think it's a good question to ponder as we think about who God is and how God works in the world. Either, however you come out on that question, for scripture anyway, this, it says nothing about the trickery. There's no comment on the trickery. It just happened. So it's not kind of a story about morality and what happens when you do the right thing and what happens when you do the wrong thing. It's not about that at all. It is a memory. It's Israel's memory of how faith moves through those raw experiences of life, through the moments of life, and how we move through that. Isaac and Esau, of course, they don't know this deception is happening. Rebecca, and they don't know the deception is happening, but also for Isaac and Esau, they are in the positions of priority, right? So people who are already at the top just assume it's all going to come out right for them. They don't have to worry about how to subvert systems in order to get what they may need or want, right? And so I think that's kind of an important thing to think about too. Both Rebecca and Jacob, even though Rebecca particularly had been told by God that Jacob would be the promise bearer, it's hard to believe in a world that tells you otherwise. And so for people who were sort of down at the bottom, consigned to the leftovers, you do have to find other ways around. Who else can we think of in scripture who's been in that position and found other ways around? What about Shiphrah and Puah? Do you know who Shiphrah and Puah are? Anybody know? They are they're the ones who helped the Israelite women give birth. In Exodus, when Pharaoh says all the male babies have to be killed, well, they are the midwives who attend the Israelite women, the Hebrew women, and they save the babies because they fear God. And then Pharaoh finds out that the babies are living, and so he calls them in. And what do they say? We don't know how this happens. These Hebrew women were so quickly, and that's before we get there. Well, how can they do that? Partly because they had a lot of chutzpah, but also because Pharaoh has no idea what happens during a birth, right? And so they are subverting the system in order to accomplish ends. And so scripture is filled with those kinds of stories. And Jacob and Rebecca, for whatever we may think of their trickery, are also in that category. So there are always multiple things going on in these stories, and that is one of those layers. So Jacob gets the blessing, he leaves, Esau comes in, here, I've brought you this food like you asked for, where's my blessing? And Isaac realizes what has happened. But Esau is forlorn. Life is nothing if you do not have this blessing. But Isaac realizes there's only one to give, and he's given it. So he still gives a blessing to Esau, which is kind of not much. It's less than scraps, really, except it does include that the yoke will be removed from him. And so this is 27:40, well, 39. Then Isaac answered Esau, see, away from the fatness of the earth shall be your home, away from the dew of heaven on high. None of that's very good. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck. And so even here we see Jacob gets the promise blessing. Jacob continues to be the promise bearer. But even in that, the blessing that Esau gets, his life's going to be hard. It is not going to be easy, but he will break free from that yoke that binds him. There will be liberation for him as well. And so what of this greater promise gets fulfilled in that? I will bless you so you will be a blessing to others, right? And we do see that reconciliation comes. I mean, that does ultimately happen even for Esau. Questions or thoughts? So Rebecca knows that Esau is ready to kill Jacob over all of this. And so she sends him away. And then there's this other little bit that comes up in 28, where she says that she tells Isaac that Jacob needs a wife, but he needs a wife from her family. And so Isaac sends him away. But either way, Jacob ends up headed towards his family, his great uncle or his uncle Laban's house, to get away. Of course, he finds a wife there as well. But here's where this promise, and particularly the blessing, begins to take hold in Jacob. Because in in Genesis 28, and I am going to read this, 10 through 22, Jacob has left. He's in between his home with his parents and his brother and his uncle's house. He's in this kind of in-between land when God comes to him specifically. So this is 28, 10 through 22. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give, I will surely give 1/10 to you. So what happens in this in-between kind of space for Jacob when Jacob is sleeping and encounters God? What happens?
Well, at the end, he bargains with God.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So he accepts it conditionally, which that is where Jacob is just another level of rascal from his ancestors, because Abraham didn't bargain with God, but Jacob is self-interest, like, okay, I'm going to do this, but you got to do this for me first. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's really important. He makes his belief in the promise and belief in God conditional on what? He wants to see that God has done this first, right? You have to feed me and clothe me and keep me safe, and then you will be my God, which is talking about the chutzpah. That's he's definitely got it. What else happens in this moment of his sleep, in this in-between place? God reiterates this promise to Jacob. So we assume up until this point, maybe Jacob kind of knew he was the promise bearer, maybe he didn't know he was the promise bearer, but he learns in this moment that he is indeed the promise bearer, that what God had promised to Abraham and to Isaac, God is now specifically promising to Jacob, and that this will go be for Jacob. So the land, the well-being for others. And then God says, I am with you until all this gets sorted out. And that I will keep you. I'm going to protect you. And that's kind of a new piece. Not new in the overall sense, but new in terms of God's getting a bit more specific here with Jacob. So what adds to the scandal of all of this is Jacob deceived his father, intentionally deceived his father. He bargained with his brother, so you can't say he deceived his brother for the birthright. But now God is, for everyone to see, binding God's self to this one specifically, even though he is a big old rascal. God is binding God's self to him. What does the dream itself tell us? That ladder, we call it Jacob's ladder. It was a ziggurat, one of those almost pyramid things, but they have steps. And so what do we get out of that dream? It goes up to heaven. So from earth to heaven, the angels are walking up and down it. What do you think that's about? Earth has to do with heaven, and heaven has to do with earth. And that the promises that God makes are coming up, that those angels, the messengers, they're bringing those back and forth. And so heaven cares about, God cares about what's going on here and providing resources to fulfill God's purposes and promises. So the world that we know it here, the sort of the earth, so to speak, as we know it, the world's ways are being impacted by the resources that God is offering. But those resources are coming to us to be used, right? So Jacob is one of the ones receiving those resources that will then be used. And so Jacob has the dream, and then God speaks to him, and what God says kind of reiterates what the dream is about, that heaven cares about earth, and that those resources are coming. And God is going to bind God's self, particularly to Jacob as the promise bearer. One other thing about dreams, and this gets played out with Joseph. Oftentimes in scripture, God comes in sleep, where we are most vulnerable. I mean, if you think about your own self, right? You are not watching what's going on around you. You are not aware. And so it's a very vulnerable time, sleep. We are in control of what's going on during our sleep. And that is when God comes into those moments. And because Jacob is also in this kind of in-between place, this particular dream comes where nothing is expected, because he's kind of running away, right? And everything is risky. His brother wants to kill him. And so it's in those moments that God comes, when nothing's expected and everything is risky. You get both here the visual image with the ziggurat as well as God's speech. So again, it's kind of a blessing because you have all of those elements that are in there. And then of course the promise is reiterated. And then we talked about Jacob responds to this promise. Oh my gosh, God is here. That's the name Bethel, the house of God. God is here. But it is conditional. And so Jacob's style of faith, I like to say, is one of the great if. He's going to believe if. He's going to act if, at least here in his early days. Questions or thoughts about that part of 28? All right. So then 29 and 30, Jacob continues on. He goes to the well. He meets Rebecca. And remember, particularly here in these stories in the Hebrew Bible, wells, important things happen at wells. Often that's where you find your wife, because that's where Abraham's servant found Rebecca to be a wife for Isaac. This is where Jacob finds Rachel, who he wants to marry. And Do you remember a New Testament story about a well?
Samaritan woman.
The Samaritan woman, right? Yes. So Jesus goes to the well. He's waiting there while his disciples to go get food, and the woman comes, and Jesus has an extended theological conversation with this woman at the well. And so for us, maybe we miss these things, but for the first century Christians would have known scripture way better than we often tend to know. They would have known the importance of wells. They would have known what happens at wells and what was happening in that encounter with Jesus and that woman, with the theological conversation, which would not have been expected. And so kind of the transformation that happens. But wells are important in our story as God's people. So Jacob meets Rachel. He falls in love with her. He wants to marry her. He's taken to her father Laban, who is his uncle, remember? And I don't know if we specifically said this last time, but when Abraham's servant went to find a wife for Isaac and goes to Rebecca's father, Laban, of course, is her brother. And Laban's kind of watching from the background until he sees all this stuff the servant offers, all the gold and the jewels and the animals. And then Laban's like, oh, I really think this is a great idea. So you get a hint back there about what Laban's going to be like. Laban gives Jacob a run for his money and vice versa. They are both heel grabbers and out for themselves. And we see that very on. And so Laban tricks Jacob, right? Jacob wants to marry Rachel. Rachel's a second child. You have to marry the first daughter first. And so he tricks him into marrying Leah. There's a lot of pathos in this story between all of these characters because Jacob doesn't love Leah. Jacob loves Rachel. And so even though he's married to Leah, he says, okay, I'll work another 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. God feels sorry for Leah because she's kind of left out. And so then Leah has 4 children, 4 boys. Finally, Rachel gets to marry Jacob. And then what enters the story again? What if one of our main features throughout the delayed promise? Barrenness. Barrenness enters again because Rachel can't get pregnant. Jacob loves Rachel more than anything else. Loves Rachel, but that is not enough because she cannot have a baby and she wants a baby. And so then what does Rachel do? It's this repeat. Rachel can't have a baby, so who does she send? Her handmaids. Her handmaid has 2 babies. Leah had 4 and now she can't have any more. So what does Leah do? Her handmaids go in. And so by this point, Jacob has 8 children. None of them are Rachel's except through the handmaid. Rachel still wants a baby. So she then tries to see if maybe the mandrakes will help. They were supposed to be, good for fertility. And so it's just that same bit with Abraham and Sarah, right? We just see that play again in through this whole story. But the mandrakes don't work either. Leah then has a couple more kids. Finally, Rachel has a baby. And who is Rachel's child? Her first child? Oh, come on, you all know the answer to this question. I'm not asking you to name all 12 kids. No, I don't. I mean, the first 11, you don't have to name. Rachel's child is Joseph. Rachel's first child is Joseph. Do you know what Joseph means? To add. So Joseph is added into this family. We're going to see later on how important his name is, how his name plays a big role in what happens for his family. But Joseph is born. And so then you kind of know why. I mean, the text tells us Jacob loves Joseph more than all the others. Why does Jacob love Joseph more than all the others?
Because it's Rachel's. It's Rachel's.
Say that again.
Because
right, because it's the child of the woman he loves. Mm-hmm. Right, that's exactly right. And so Joseph becomes the promise bearer. We don't know that specifically at this point in the story, but you can kind of begin to sense it because Jacob loves him the most. And how's the other reason? What's the other reason you can kind of guess that Joseph is now going to be the promise bearer? That whole delayed promise business. It's going to be the one God chooses on God's time, in God's time. And so that whole delayed business. So Rachel does have this child, and that was 29 and 30. I know I'm kind of flying through this, but we still have 20 chapters to do. So don't think I'm just cutting you short. And so then in 31 and 32, Jacob decides it's time to go. He spent enough time here with Laban. Jacob's become quite wealthy, though, in his little sojourn there with Laban. So has Laban, by the way. They all end up with a lot. But he decides it's time to go. And in 31, verse 3, God says, return to the land of your ancestors and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So partly he decides it's time to go because God calls him, but also because I think he's tired of Laban and all of Laban's shenanigans as well. And so there's this conflict that comes up between Jacob and Laban about going. Laban doesn't really want him to go. Then there's this whole thing about the speckled sheep and all the rest of that. But he goes, at the end of it, they covenant with one another, essentially to say, we're going to go our own ways in peace. And so that relationship has some sort of reconciliation to it. But Jacob is called to go home to his ancestors, which means what particularly? Who does he have to meet? He's going home to his ancestors. Who's there?
Esau.
That's right, Esau, the one that he kind of ran away from all those years ago. So that is, I'm sure, kind of weighing heavy on him, like, whew, okay, God, I'm going back. And you said you're going to be with me, but what kind of lies ahead for me? He gets, he sends people ahead. He gets a good word from his brother that he's glad he's coming home. He kind of wants to believe, but he doesn't quite believe that. And so he prays to God that Esau won't kill him, that God will be true to God's promises of protection and presence and many descendants. And this is the only extended prayer in Genesis. And so this is in 32:9. And I'm going to read kind of an extended section because then, I'm going to read some and then read another bit. But anyway, this is 32:9. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord who said to me, so he's reminding him, this is what you said, God, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. Remember, God, remember that you said that? I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness you have shown to your servant. So he's kind of throwing himself on God's mercy. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. That's how much his wealth grew. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. So that's the extended prayer. That's the only extended prayer in Genesis. And Jacob is like, okay, it's that remember piece, which we talked about in the flood, which we talked about with Abraham and God and Lot. Remembering is very important in our story as God's people. And so right here, Jacob is imploring God to remember your promises, remember what you have said, remember who you are. And so then we're going to pick up in 22. He gets good word. He spends the night. He gets good word that things are going to be okay, but he's still not 100% sure. So this is 22. The same night, he got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. So he sends everybody across and he stays back. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. And so what happens in this second dream? So again, we're here in this risky time, right? This is a vulnerable time of sleep, and God comes to him. And what happens? He encounters a stranger, right? A man. That's all it says. He encounters this man, and they wrestle all night long. Kind of like Jacob's life, really, right? Jacob's life has been one of striving and wrestling, and now he's wrestling with this man who Jacob himself believes to be God. And so what does Jacob want?
A blessing.
Well, he doesn't want a blessing. He gets a blessing, but what does he want? He wants to know the name of the one with whom he has been wrestling all night.
Oh, no.
He doesn't get a name. He gets a blessing instead. God turns it around and says, "What's your name?" And he says, "I'm Jacob." And then God says, "No longer, your name will be Israel," which means striving with God and with man. And so the same thing, this is the same thing that's happened before with Abram and Sarah. You get new names as you move along through this story, being God's people in the world. And so he gets a new name. It's interesting how God avoids it and says, "What's your name?" Turns it around, you get a new name and a blessing. So he gets a new name and a blessing and a broken hip all at the same time. He limps away, probably had a limp the rest of his life, remembering always his blessing, right? There's a lot to mine in that the things that are painful are also carry blessings for us in some way when we're able to see those, that they kind of go hand in hand. The limp and the blessing go hand in hand. God sees Jacob as a worthy opponent, obviously, because they wrestle all night long. But why might God have decided on this night of all nights to come wrestle with Jacob? Any thoughts about why on that particular night? Maybe God recognized that was the moment that Jacob was feeling, number one, maybe the most vulnerable he had felt in all of his life, because now he had to go back to his brother. He had to acknowledge all that he had done. And Jacob's always, it's the conditional belief, right? And so maybe that was the night that God chose, because Jacob needed to shift from conditional belief to outright belief. and that an encounter with God may be the thing to do that. And what does Jacob say? Which is similar to Hagar's story, right? But Jacob names the place. Hagar names God, right, Elroy? Jacob names the place, but both claim those names because of what?
Encounter God.
They encountered God, and I saw God face to face, and I lived. And I think that's the hinge part, and maybe why God chose that particular night, is that Jacob needed to see God face to face, even if he didn't have a name, which names are really important. He doesn't have a name yet, but he names the place in recognition of what had happened, because he acknowledges that he saw God face to face, and he's lived to tell the tale. And this is kind of a hinge for Jacob, because though he continues to be a bit of a trickster, at least in his encounter with his brother, he does begin to change. Like, his belief in this promise solidifies and grows roots from this point out in his story. And so this really is a transformative moment for Jacob's own faith in the promise and the purposes to which he has been called and his family has been called. It doesn't mean his children don't struggle, but he himself, this is a hinge point for him. And so he wakes up the next morning. God goes on. He wakes up the next morning. He sees Esau coming. He has a good meeting with Esau. They hug each other. They kiss each other. They weep on one another. And there's an interesting thing here in let's see, it's in verse 10, because remember, so he says, I've seen God face to face, and he offers all this stuff to Esau. Esau says, I have enough. I don't need all the things you've given me. Obviously, God had blessed him too. And Jacob says in verse 10, no, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. And that's, again, that's that recognition of this transformation that Jacob is making, because that's the moment that he began to shift in belief of that. And so he sees his brother, there's reconciliation between them, and it's like seeing the face of God. So whatever he had been afraid of, whatever he had expected, there was grace in that moment, not revenge. There was simply grace. So Esau says, oh, come be with me. You know, he's supposed to go back to his ancestral land. Jacob says, I'm coming, but we've got all of these little children, and they're pretty slow. And then we've got all these new baby animals, and they're pretty slow. And so it's going to take us a while. You don't wait for us. You just go on ahead, and we will get there when we get there. Esau says, okay, that's fine. And then what does Jacob do? He goes a different direction. So he doesn't go back to his brother at all. But there has been reconciliation. And we see in a few chapters in this story, when Isaac dies, Esau and Jacob both bury him. So similar to Isaac and Ishmael burying Abraham, Esau and Jacob both buried Isaac. And so that reconciliation truly happened. While I would love to spend some time talking about chapters 33 and 34, we don't really have time. However, it's an important story. This is their sojourn in Shechem. We talked a bit about this last week. The whole circumcision business and how marks of faith can be important, but they can also then cause you to use them in ways that they're not meant to be used. And that's what happens here, is that they're in Shechem, and Jacob's only named daughter, Dinah, has an encounter with one of the men from Shechem. Her brothers get upset about this, believe she has been raped, and it's, you know, an offense against them. And so they really want to kill everybody, but they devise the plan and say, if only all of you will be circumcised, then all will be well. But what do? Several days into their healing from their circumcision, they go kill them all. Jacob is beside himself, upset about all of this. and what his children have done, and they move on from Shechem. But that's kind of what happens in those chapters. Chapter 35 then is kind of Jacob's response to that outrageous thing that happened. And so there's a purification rite at Bethel. So they're back to Bethel that he makes there, which is a way to repent of what had happened in that place. Let's see, in 35:9, we get God comes back to Jacob. So I'm going to read 9 through 15. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram, and he blessed him. So do you remember at the beginning? Abraham was all about the promise. Jacob's going to be all about the blessing. Do you remember how many times now God has come and blessed Jacob? And Jacob's living into this blessing. So he comes and he blesses Jacob, and God says, your name is Jacob. No longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he was called Israel. And God said, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come for you, and kings shall spring from you. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him at the place where he had spoken with him. Jacob sets up a pillar in that place and pours a drink offering on it, oil on it, and Jacob called that place Bethel. So it's a reiteration of place names become very important in Hebrew history, and so we get several different iterations why a place is named what it is, but it's a recognition again that God is with them. And the dream episode where God wrestles with Jacob and names him Israel is for Jacob. This time where God comes and names him Israel is really for the whole people. So now, and of course, we talk about Israel as being the people of God, not just this person, Jacob. And so there's these two tellings of that, because one is specifically for Jacob, and then one is specifically for the people of God. And that's what's going on here, is that now a new community of people is being called out. The rest of that chapter, they continue journeying. Rachel has a second child, but she dies in childbirth. They're on their way towards what we now know as Bethlehem, and she dies along the way in childbirth. Benjamin is her child. She gives him one name. Jacob gives him a different name, but Benjamin is the name Jacob gave him and is the name he carries. She's buried on the road to Bethlehem, and her tomb is there. And if you've ever been to Israel, there is a place right outside Bethlehem that is called Rachel's tomb. It's heavily guarded these days. Then we go through the rest of 35 goes through all the sons. So we get the 12 tribes of Israel. Interestingly, and I want to highlight this here, Leah's sons don't fare so well. Now, these 12 become the 12 tribes of Israel, the ones born to Leah, the ones born to Rachel, and then the ones born to the handmaids. Levi and Simeon are the ones who are behind the whole terrible business at Shechem. They just kill everybody. When they get upset about something, they just kill everybody. Reuben, we will learn later, he sleeps with one of the handmaidens, trying to usurp his father's power. Now, where else do we hear of that in scripture? God's people, we have short memories. We forget. One of David's sons does the same thing, right? Tries to sleep with his concubine, and then kind of gets in trouble for that. So Levi, Simeon try to kill everybody. Reuben tries to usurp his father's power by sleeping with the concubine. Judah, chapter 38 tells us the whole story about Judah. Briefly, I'm going to tell you that story. We won't do it when we get to 38. We're going to do it now. Judah has sons, and in the Hebrew tradition, if a son dies before he has had children, then his wife marries the next brother. This is called the levirate marriage practice. And that brother then has a child with her that's really for the first son, right? Okay, so that was the practice. that's the whole thing about the woman at the well too, potentially. Like, did she have all these because she was caught in the levirate marriage practice? But anyway, so Judah has this son. He's married to Tamar. His son dies. So Tamar's then married to the second son. The second son dies, all before they've had children. So then she should marry the third child, the third son. But Judah withholds the third son because he doesn't want the third son to die too. Like, he's somehow got in his head that these, it's all connected. So he withholds him. But Tamar knows that she has no security without a child. She also knows that the levirate marriage practice says she gets to marry this child. Judah will have nothing of it. He's kind of put her out. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Tamar takes matters into her own hands. She sets up as a prostitute on the road. Judah comes to her. She keeps his staff. She ends up pregnant. She tells Judah that they're his babies. He doesn't believe it until she has the staff, of course. That whole story is told, it has nothing to do with sexual morality. The whole story is told to say Tamar was the one who was faithful to the Hebrew law. Judah was not. However, Judah becomes the ancestor of whom? Through those two baby boys that Tamar has? Jesus. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, and Tamar, along with her two sons born of Judah, are listed in Jesus's genealogy in Matthew. Again, highlighting the importance of Tamar in the story, because Tamar followed the Hebrew law, not Judah. Judah, though, is the tribe from which Jesus comes. Okay, sorry, little side note, but not so side because it's right here, but we're not going to go through 38. So 36 tells us the genealogy of Esau, all of his descendants. 37, we get into Jacob. All right, so we've got 30 minutes and we're going to go through Jacob's story. But Joseph's story. Before we move to Joseph, any questions or lingering thoughts about Jacob? Yes, Debbie.
Okay, why did he go the other direction instead of following his brother?
Because he was Jacob, and that's what Jacob did. I mean, I can't give you a more specific answer, but Jacob was really always about himself. He got the reconciliation that he wanted, but he didn't need to go live over there again. He was going to continue to go do his own thing. So, yeah, I think it's just more of, even though he does get transformed, there's still a bit of that old Jacob in him. And so he goes his own way. Joseph's story. So Joseph is the 11th child, but the beloved child because of who his mother was. He is, again, the inversion of what you expect in terms of who's going to have the promise, who's going to have the blessing, all of those kinds of things. But then you add the layer onto that Joseph is a dreamer. So we can imagine he's got all these older brothers. His father doesn't probably expect much out of him because, well, he's got 10 other sons and he loves him so much. He kind of protects him more. And, he gave him this special coat and all of these kinds of things. And then Joseph's probably just a bit odd because he talks about his dreams all the time. And he has all this time to daydream, and he doesn't have the same responsibilities. So you see right here, I mean, all of these tensions are set up just like they were set up for Esau and Jacob. They're set up here in 37 for Jacob and his sons, particularly with Joseph. But dreams, we've seen that with Jacob, right? The dream business. We see it in Matthew with Joseph, where all these things happen in dreams. Dreams are a particular vehicle through which God shares God's purposes with us. And then we have to live them out, right? So like with Joseph in Matthew, the dreams came to Joseph, but he could have chosen to act on them or not, right? He could have chosen to take his family into Egypt or not. So dreams are the vehicle by which God conveys God's purposes and promises to us, but then we have responsibilities to act on those or to understand them. And Joseph is the dreamer. So Joseph has all of these dreams, and he has this one dream here. Well, it's probably one he has a lot that sets him above his brothers, and they all understand that. But no, do not like it, right? His brothers are just done with all of that. And so so we get in 37, 5 through 36, we really begin to see the power of these dreams and the tensions that they continue to create about them. And I want to read just verses 5 through 11. This is 37, 5 through 11. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to the sheaf. I mean, you can just imagine, right? All these older brothers. His brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? What are you thinking? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. And so then he has another dream about the sun and the moon and similar kinds of things. And so his brothers are like, we've got to get rid of this dreamer. They are done with the dreamer. And then, of course, we know, well, and part of that, again, is this inversion. Older brothers aren't supposed to bow down to younger brothers. That is not the way it's supposed to work. But there's this kind of new possibility that comes out through his dreams, right? This new ordering, this new way of being. And of course, it threatens the current way. It threatens the status quo, calls it into question. And we know that it threatens the brothers particularly. So they decide to do something about him. We all know they take him to kill him, but they can't quite kill him. They put him in a pit. And then they're going to kill him later, right? This is Reuben trying to say, well, we'll do it, but we're going to do it later. And then the other brothers find him and are like, oh, we'll just sell him to these people passing by. Well, then Reuben takes his clothes, makes it look like he was eaten by a lion, deceives his father. So what happens when you try to kill the dream, when you try to ignore the new things that God are doing or the purposes and promises of God that are out there in the world? What ends up happening? You have to lie about things, right? So you're trying to deceive about what's actually happening, but then you have to tell more lies. So you have to tell this one lie, then you have to tell another lie, and then you have to tell another lie. It calls for deception to sort of go against these promises and purposes. Requires endless deception. Resistance to those requires endless deception. So Joseph is taken into Egypt. For Joseph and for God, the dream is not dead. The promise is still possible, and God has not abandoned God's purposes. The brothers don't know that, of course. 38 is the Tamar interlude, which we talked about. 39, Joseph ends up there. He ends up working for the empire. And then Potiphar's wife, Potiphar's an official, Potiphar's wife finds him. She tries to have an affair with him. He will have nothing of it, but she makes it look like he does. He ends up in jail. Okay, so that's 39 is Potiphar's wife's story. Interesting that they go side by side with Tamar's story. It'd be kind of curious to do a little study comparison of the two. But we're not going to do that right now because we don't have time. And so then 40, Joseph is in prison. Everybody has dreams. Nobody can understand them, but Joseph is fabulous at interpreting dreams. And so Joseph ends up interpreting all the dreams of all these other prisoners. And he's the only one who can do it. Nobody else in the empire seems to have the ability to interpret these dreams, but he does. And so God continues to work through him. In verse 8, 40 verse 8, Joseph says, so they come and say, we have dreams and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. So he acknowledges that God's the one to do this. God is using him to interpret these dreams. But then he says in verse 14, so he's interpreted a dream. for the cupbearer. And then he tells the cupbearer, he says, remember me when it is well with you. So when this dream works out well, because some of the dreams he interprets, the people end up dead, and they do end up dead. And this one, it ends up good with the cupbearer. And so he says, when everything's well with you, remember me. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. So it's like Joseph knows he's doing something he's supposed to be doing, but he doesn't want to be doing it from jail. He wants out of there. And so there's kind of this sadness in his story. He was taken from home, now he's in jail. And so it's between that sort of real confidence and belief that God is working God's purposes out through these promises and needing to be remembered that Joseph finds himself. He's in between those. And again, that remembering comes into play, that things get stuck until the remembering occurs. And so he asks to be remembered. In between those, really believing that these things are going to happen, that God's in the midst of this, and wanting to be remembered, we still have to live faithfully. We are still called to live the way that God has placed upon us to live. In 41, Pharaoh begins to have dreams, and this is when things really begin to shift. Pharaoh begins to have dreams. All the people of the empire who were supposed to figure these things out, none of them can do it. The wisdom of the world is nothing compared to God, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this, that the wisdom of the empire, the wisdom of the world is useless, that it's God's wisdom that needs to come into play. And so Pharaoh then, I got to find somebody. We can't figure these things out. And guess what happens? The cupbearer happens to be in Pharaoh's presence and goes, oh yeah, God, there was this guy. It's been 2 years. So Joseph has been in jail for at least 2 years. But the cupbearer remembers Joseph, tells Pharaoh about him. Pharaoh says, go get him. Joseph comes and he interprets these dreams for Pharaoh when nobody else could. And of course, it's about the famine that is to come and what they need to do in preparation for that so that they will be able to take care of themselves. Again, dreams, right? Pharaoh has dreams that need to be interpreted. God breaks in to those vulnerable moments that occur in sleep. The inbreaking of God's way, God's will, God's purposes often comes in through dreams at night. And so Joseph is remembered. He is able to interpret these dreams. And it's important, I think, here to realize that it's Pharaoh, the world, right? The ways of the world need help. And Joseph comes to help them. It's God's working through human history, right? So God does all the things that God does, but through us. And so we have these responsibilities to do these things. 41. So I'm not going to read all that because we don't have time. But that was just so if you don't remember Pharaoh's dreams that then lead to this understanding of the drought, go back and read 41:9 through 36, because there you will have it. And so then, because the part that I do want to read to you, though, is 33. So Joseph has explained the whole dream, and he says in verse 33, now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers. He says these are the ways you need to make sure that we can live out this dream properly. And Pharaoh says in 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone else like this one, the one in whom is the Spirit of God? Which is interesting, given all of his things failed. Where else do we see that all of the machinations and all of the wisdom of the kingdom, of the world, of the empire fail in the face of what God is doing? Think of Matthew again. the Magi come and they say, this thing has happened. Can you tell us where he is? And Herod's like, I don't know about this. So he goes off in secret and he asks all these people, what do you know? And none of them know anything. And so he says, well, you go, and when you find him, you let me know, right? But then they kind of sense that something's off. All the powers of the world are nothing when it comes to understanding what God's ways are. It's what God conveys through God's promises and purposes. It's God's wisdom is always to be chosen over the world's wisdom, because the world's wisdom is always lacking. So Pharaoh chooses Joseph to be the one to oversee all of this stuff. And we see in this story, Joseph's brothers don't yet know, but we see that unknowingly his brothers have advanced rather than killed the dream, right? They have advanced God's purposes and God's promises when they were trying to just stamp them out. So 42 through 44, Jacob, there's the famine hits. Jacob sends his sons to Egypt because he hears that Egypt has food, and they not only have enough food for themselves, but they have enough food to share with outsiders. And so they go. Now, at this point, Joseph is an Israelite promise bearer, although he may not have called himself that. And he is also fully an Egyptian royal power figure, right? So you can imagine him with the very dark eyes and the headdress, all those things that we think about with Egyptians. That's what Joseph looked like when he sat on that chair in the room where all the people coming to ask for food had to come. So his brothers did not recognize him. They didn't know who he was, but immediately he did, right? He knew who they were immediately. And understandably, he doesn't just react with grace and forgiveness and reconciliation. He's pretty upset and angry. The brothers can't even imagine that it might be Joseph, that this other world is possible, because they're still living in their guilt about what had happened. They've kind of stuck in their status quo and they can't imagine anything else. And so it's not until chapter 45. So there's 3 chapters, 42, 43, and 44, where this whole thing plays out. And you all know the story where Joseph sends them to go get Benjamin, and then plants the cup in the bag so that they all have to come back. And finally, in 45, reveals himself to his brothers. And that announcement irreversibly shatters the presumed world of the family. They thought they knew how things were going to go, right? The brother's gone. We live with this guilt. The father lives with this grief. This is just kind of how the world is. But now the one that they thought was dead is alive. And the dream with him is alive. The one that they had abandoned now sits in front of them in power. And so Joseph, in revealing himself, breaks with the past, with his own grief, with his own anger and frustration and hurt. He breaks with that past and invites them all into a new future. That inviting comes back into play, where God invited all of creation into being. Now Joseph is inviting them into a new future. And so this, I think, is important that we see in this story. The power to create newness, which is what Joseph does when he invites his brothers into this new future. The power to create newness does not come from detachment. So Joseph could have just given them their food and let them go on their way, right? It does not come from detachment. Joseph could have chosen not to interpret everybody's dreams, even though he knew what the interpretations were. The newness comes, the power to create something new comes from risky, self-disclosing engagement. You've got to get into the mess of it all. You've got to take the risks, go where God calls you when you don't know where you're going. You've got to take the risks. You've got to say who you are and what you're about. Those are the ways that we have the power to create newness. That's the opposite of being vulnerable. I mean, that is being vulnerable. It's the opposite of kind of this, we're in control, we've got it all in hand, right? And yet, God came to us in the form of a baby. I mean, that's some risky self-disclosure right there. And so I think it's important to recognize what Joseph did was not from his place of power in the Egyptian royalty court, but from this place of vulnerability in saying, this is who I am, and created a new future for them. And so what we see then is that the purposes of God have continued to be at work. Even we thought, when we may have thought that they were being thwarted in one way or another, they have continued to be at work, even through all the crazy things that these people have done. And it is indeed the arena of life where humans live and work and interact that God's saving work is done. That's where it happens. It's not somewhere else, but it's right here in our midst. God is working in and through us all the time. So God's purposes are finally sovereign. God can create newness. God is utterly gracious, and Joseph is utterly gracious in this self-disclosure, and it's all worked out in concrete history. 46 and 47, the family journeys to Egypt. So Joseph says who I am, and then he says, go get my father, bring him to me. They do. He sends, tons of chariots for them to bring all their stuff back. And so the family journeys to Egypt then in 46 and 47. God speaks to Jacob, to Israel, reiterating the promises. So God says more or less, you can go to Egypt. It's going to be okay. We're still going to work all of this out like I've told you forever. You can go to Egypt. It doesn't have to be here in Canaan. You can go to Egypt. And so Jacob does. When Jacob gets there, he sees Joseph. Of course, they have their emotional meeting with one another. And then Joseph takes Jacob to meet Pharaoh. And you know what Jacob does? He blesses Pharaoh. Jacob comes into the presence of Pharaoh and blesses Pharaoh. There's nothing pretentious about that. It is a living out of the blessing. So when we talk about all of Jacob's stories about blessing, he gets finally that he has been blessed to be a blessing, that Abraham was blessed to be a blessing, that the people of God bless others through themselves. And so he literally offers a blessing to Pharaoh. Embedded in that is the knowledge that even Egypt, even that empire, needs Jacob and Jacob's family because the promise rests with them. And so their blessing, the blessing of Egypt, is bound up in the blessing of Jacob. How else do we know that? Because Joseph's the one who figured out the dream, which enabled them to even have the grain to stay alive during the famine. Jacob wants to be buried in Canaan. Jacob, even though he trusts that God said you can go to Egypt, that's all okay. Jacob wants to be buried in Canaan because that's the land of the promise, right? And so symbolically, you go and you're buried there because he continues to wait for the fulfillment of the promise, and that faithful waiting, even beyond a lifetime, his life is now over. So that faithful waiting, even beyond a lifetime, is a standing ground for the true promises against every other alternative. And I think we mentioned last time too that Jeremiah buys the plot of land even when they're going into exile. It's the same kind of thing. You do these things that make no sense because you believe in these promises. So Jacob is buried there. Before he is buried, though, he blesses Joseph's two sons, and he offers blessings to them both. In those blessings, he reiterates. So this is 48, 3 through 22. I'm not going to read all of it, but he essentially reiterates the promises that God has made to him to Joseph's children, because he recognizes that they are now the promise bearers. But this is the part I want to read to you. So this is 15. Okay, let me say this too. So Joseph has two children. Manasseh is the oldest and Ephraim is the youngest. So those are the two, Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay. So Joseph puts the sons near Jacob for them to receive this blessing. And Israel stretches out his right hand. This is verse 14. Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the hand of Ephraim. Now, the right hand is your blessing hand, by the way. Lays it on the head of Ephraim. Who is Ephraim? The second born. Okay. He puts his right hand on Ephraim, who was the younger, and on the left hand of Manasseh. So Joseph had put them so that Manasseh was here for Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim was here for Jacob's left hand. This is what Jacob does, and offers, says this blessing. The God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, bless the boys, and in them let my name be perpetuated, and the name of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow in a multitude of the earth. Joseph then says, oh my gosh, he's messed up. Maybe he just couldn't see. And so Joseph moves his hands so that maybe there will be some final words of blessing that they get it right. And Jacob said, oh, no, that is not it. And Jacob puts them back. And so Jacob said, 20, and this is in 19. I know, my son, I know I moved my hands the wrong way. I know, and he also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. And so he blessed them. And then there's this, the further blessing. Here's what's interesting about this, okay? Joseph is the 11th son. Joseph has been the promise bearer. Joseph was the one who ruled over his older brothers. Like, he knows all of these things, and yet how does he want it to happen for his sons? The way we expect it, right? Even though Joseph himself lived outside of that expectation and did it to the blessing of everyone, he still has in his head, this is the way it's supposed to be done. And so when Jacob, whether Jacob intentionally did it or that was how God was involved with it or whatever, make sure the youngest son gets the right-handed blessing, Joseph gets all outdone about it. But Jacob will hear none of it and continues on. Because that's the way of God, right? This inversion happens all the time. Okay, let's see. 49, Jacob blesses his 12 sons, but it's not really a blessing. He kind of tells them what's going to happen in their life, and it's not all so lovely. But he does sort of go through that in 49. In 50, we have his death, and he is buried, and they're all together there with him. And there's a lovely encounter with Joseph in that. But then the thing that happens at the very end of 50, and this is the part that we all remember, right? It comes at the very end of this story. But as they are all kind of realizing that Jacob has died, his brothers are overcome with guilt, I guess. And they come to Joseph. Well, I think they're overcome with guilt, but I think they're more afraid that now that Jacob is dead, Joseph may turn on them. And they may get sort of their just desserts. And so they come to Joseph, and this is verse 18. they wept, they fell down before him, and they said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do me harm, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people." So Joseph recognizes that the promise went through him. "So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. And then the story ends. Joseph is buried in Egypt, not in Canaan. And so Joseph offers them grace in his response and says, "Yeah, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good, for the sake of the whole world," right? So not just for me, not just for you, but for the sake of the whole world. And so when he tells them, "Don't be afraid, I'm not God," he recognizes that that God's purposes are bigger than any of them, and that God's power is greater than anything that any one of them can do. And so he comes to believe in the promises of God completely himself in that moment, I believe. Okay, so let me real quickly just give you my 3-sentence overview of Genesis, which is big, right? All along, God's intention for all of creation is that it be lovely, pleasing, beautiful. Good is the word that Genesis used, but we talked about that doesn't mean morally good, but beautiful and pleasing. And only the God of Israel can guarantee that lovely, pleasing, well-being life. Nobody else can. We can't on our own. The empires can't. Nobody else can. Only God can guarantee this life of well-being for everyone. And so, as people of faith, we are not called to leave it all in God's hands. We've heard that, right? That's not what we're supposed to do. Nor are we called to live into this "God has no hands but our own." We've probably used that phrase or heard that phrase too. Instead, we recognize and acknowledge that God does have a plan, right? God does have purposes that God is fulfilling. And we, as God's people, as the promise bearers in the world, have responsibilities in that plan and purpose. So it's not that it's all up to God or it's only up to us because God chose us, but it is up to God, and we are called to work with God in making it all happen. That's very Reformed too, by the way. Okay, it is 4:33. Got time for the questions real quick? So here are my pondering questions.
Oh,
But
no.
before I get to the pondering questions, in case some of you need to leave, I would love to get some thoughts from you all about how this went, and we really don't have time to do it now, particularly on Zoom. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, if you are willing, is to share your email address in the chat. And then I'm going to send those of you who have emailed kind of a little survey that will help us know what you've thought about this. Is this a good thing to do? Should we can think about doing it every year? Anyway, a whole variety of things. James is going to put my email address in the chat as well. And so if you're not comfortable putting yours there for everybody to see, then you can just write mine down and send it directly to me. Send yours directly to me. All right. And so you already have mine, so you know, and I have yours. So I would really appreciate if you're willing to share your thoughts with me. Either email me directly through my email address that James has put in the chat, or share your email address, and then I can send you a little survey form. Okay, so here's our final questions. What have you learned about the God who calls us? I've asked you this one every single time. But what have you learned about the God who calls us? What have you learned about our ability to listen? And what have we learned about how we choose to respond to the call that God has placed upon us? We have lots of examples now, right, of how people have chosen to respond to that. How do we respond? And here's the one that's new for today. How is God calling you as an individual, but us as the church as well? So you could think of your particular church or us as the larger church, but how is God calling you to be bearers of the promise in our broken and chaotic world? How is God calling you to be bearers of the promise in our broken and chaotic world?
Answer that, honey.
Say that again, Debbie.
Oh, Oh.
Sorry, you just every time I hear you, then your square lights up. Did you not mean to say
oh,
anything?
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for you to hear that. I was telling Jimmy to answer that for me because I wanted to hear his answer. So sorry.
Well, I didn't. All I heard was noise, so I didn't hear anything y'all said other than the noise. But Jimmy could email me and share his answer too. All right, so those are my final kind of questions for you all to ponder. Anything you all want to share before we close with our benediction? I want to thank you all for being present for 4 weeks, for hanging in there as we jammed lots of chapters into one week. We certainly could have spent more time. But thank you for being here. Thank you for being attentive and listening and giving up time on your Sunday. I have really enjoyed doing it, and I hope that you all have found it beneficial as well. So anything you all want to share before we benedict? Yeah, I saw a hand go up somewhere.
So Wendy, one thing is like, you know, first you are like, you cheated the blessing and that was still okay, you know, instead of God, no, hey, you know, listen, that you need to, you know. So it's like me being a drug dealer, you know, making a ton of money, and then I am the poster child of philanthropy because I give money to the church. And
Yeah,
God said, I blessed your drug dealing, and now you are blessing to, you know. So it's
right.
I feel a little bit, you know, I would be more fair and say, hey, you cheated, you don't get anything here, you know.
Yeah, it's great to talk about God's purposes and God's promises and God using the people we don't expect when it all falls in line with our expectations, right?
Yeah.
With what our ideas of fairness are. But God's ways are often inscrutable, and the challenge to continue to trust in the promises that God gives is to trust in them even when God does things that seem unfair to us or uses people that seem unworthy to us to also be working out those purposes. That's the challenge to us. The good news for us is that there may be ways that we too don't live up to sort of those high expectations of who should be promise bearers, and yet God continues to use us as promise bearers. And so I think, you know, the good news is you can screw up in life, but it doesn't put you outside of God's purposes or promises, not only to you, but for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And we do see through the story of Jacob, particularly, that he was very self-interested, but he does transform. And at the end, he's much more in line with God's purposes and promises. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly not easy. Oh.
Yeah, well, you know, I always say it's like, I honestly said, you know, yes, the studies, you know, I learned, but then it's like, you know, all my faith fits on a little index card, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and the rest
That's
I
not
say, you know what? I don't understand.
Right.
I don't know what's here, you know. And
Yeah.
and then I say, God, you know, he understands way more. It's not my position to ask or whatever, you know. Like I said, you know. So you confuse
Accept
me
the history
sometimes
of
more,
God.
you know.
Yes. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yes, Wendy, I wanted to thank you very much for making us
Thank
think
you.
again about so much that we thought we knew.
Thank you, Alan. All right, if there is no one else, then I'm going to end us. This is going to be a strange benediction because it's more an affirmation of faith. And it comes from the Iona community. But hopefully it connects with what we're doing and indeed moves us out into the world. So here we go. We believe that God is present in the darkness before dawn, in the waiting and uncertainty, where fear and courage join hands, conflict and caring link arms, and the sun rises over barbed wire. We believe in a with us God who sits down in our midst to share our humanity. We affirm a faith that takes us beyond the safe place, into action, into vulnerability, and into the streets. We commit ourselves to work for change and put ourselves on the line to bear responsibility, take risks, live powerfully, and face humiliation, to stand with those on the edge, to choose life, and be used by the Spirit for God's new community of hope. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank you.